Between 1914 and 1920, the wealth of the United States increased by 250% due to exports of foods, armaments, and other products industrialized to Europe during World War I and growing trade with Latin America and Asia. Agriculture became mechanized, the factories increased their production, goods arrived in stores with more affordable prices for the consumer. All of this marked the beginning of a period known as the Roaring Twenties. At that time, there was the idea that prosperity was within everyone's reach. It was, however, an illusory idea, since 90% of the national income was concentrated in the hands of only 13% of the population. About 6 million families lived with just $3 a day. The innovative products and the abundance of food, symbols of the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties, were used only by the middle and upper classes, who had the purchasing power necessary for consumption of the countless new products in the factories: automobiles, refrigerators, electric stoves, vacuum cleaners, radios, and more. This incessant search for new durable goods gave rise to the phenomenon of consumerism. This lifestyle, known as the American way of life, was seen by the American middle class as the best and most modern in the world. Until the first decades of the 20th century, immigrants could enter freely on the territory of the United States. During the post-war period, however, the situation was reversed and a wave of xenophobia took over the country. Immigrants began to be seen as a threat to employment of local workers, and as some were supporters of anarchist and socialist ideas, the government began to see them as a threat to social order and the political system as well. As a result, several laws were created to restrict the entry and stay of foreigners. Intolerance spread across the country. At that time, the secret society, Ku Klux Klan, created after the Civil War with the aim of safeguarding white supremacy, reached 5 million members. They persecuted and murdered African Americans, Jewish people, immigrants, and others. Racial discrimination and prejudice further accentuated social tensions. Violent racial conflicts erupted in several regions. League and associations for the defense of morals and good customs emerged all over. Claiming the need to liberate the lower classes from danger of alcohol, the government passed a law in 1919 that prohibited the manufacture, the sale, and transport of alcoholic beverages. However, the decree did not extinguish the consumption of beverages, which, with the ban, encouraged its clandestine production and sale. As it was an illegal market, it ended favoring the expansion of organized crime. Gangs emerged that, in addition to smuggling alcoholic beverages, controlled brothels, gambling houses, and drug trafficking. The exciting nightlife, consumer euphoria, prohibition, prosperity, and high crime made the 20s also known as the crazy years. Between 1925 and 1929, the value of shares on the New York Stock Exchange passed from $27 billion to $67 billion. The President Herbert Hoover even asserted in the early 1929 that the United States was the nation that was closest to the end of poverty in all of world history. However, in October 1929, there was the beginning of the worst economic crisis in the history of the United States and the capitalist world so far, the Great Depression. This happened because Americans produced much more than the country and the rest of the world were capable of consuming. There was an overproduction crisis, and because of high inventories, factories began to lay off many workers. The entire production line, trade, and consumption was affected. On the stock exchange, the lowest share prices of some companies affected the balance between buyers and sellers. On the 24th of October 1929, the stock price plummeted, which caused the New York Stock Exchange crash. The crash's impact on the U.S. economy was catastrophic. National income was halved. More than 5,000 banks closed, leaving their customers penniless. 80,000 factories and 32,000 commercial houses went bankrupt. About 15 million workers were unemployed. In the countryside, thousands of farms went bankrupt, and many farmers, with no way to pay the debts, had to abandon their lands. Hunger and misery spread across the country. Millions became homeless. They also headed to the shelters of the government, constantly crowded, and charities served popular soups. World trade had broken down. World prices for agricultural products have collapsed. Nations that had economies depended mainly on agricultural exports to the United States and to Europe were deeply impacted. One of the few countries to escape the crisis was the Soviet Union, because its economy didn't obey the laws of the market like the capitalist economies. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt assumed the presidency of the United States and proposed a plan known as the New Deal, which articulated the actions of the government with those of the private initiative, having among its objectives to raise the income of workers. Several measures were adopted, such as the dollar devaluation to make exports more competitive, loans to banks to prevent further failures, implementation of a social security system with the creation of the unemployment insurance, creation of a vast program of public works in order to generate new jobs, minimum wage and right to organize unions and stimulus to agricultural production. The country's economy was reheated and the industry returned to production. More than 8 million jobs were created and thousands of public works, such as roads, schools, and dams, were completed. Despite this economic recovery, more recent studies show that the New Deal failed to stimulate economic growth at levels prior to the First World War. In addition, the resulting achievements of this program were not democratically distributed, as they mainly favored the owners of industrial complexes. Racial exclusion also remained. African Americans were the social group that felt the effects of the 1929 crisis the most, but they were not the object of concern for the Roosevelt administration. While the end of World War I caused an unprecedented wave of economic euphoria in the United States, in other places of the world, this situation was quite different. Africa remained subjugated by European nations. In the rest of America, ruled an exclusive and exploitative agrarian elite. Europe struggled to rebuild their countries. At the same time, Russia, which would become part of the Soviet Union from 1922, represented a strong state and a future of equality and social justice. Although they had antagonistic characteristics from an ideological point of view, the authoritarian movements that emerged in Europe and the Soviet government centered on the figure of Joseph Stalin from 1924 onwards converged towards totalitarianism. No previous regime resembled this new form of control of power. One of the hallmarks of totalitarianism is the concentration of power in the hands of a small group of people who organize themselves in a single party. This party also relies on a popular base, but only its leaders have decision-making powers and they are the ones who occupy the middle and high positions in public administration. Thus, through police repression, they exert power over individuals. In this, freedom is suppressed and there is a regime based on terror and obedience. Another striking feature of the totalitarian state is the use of ideological propaganda, which exalts the regime, the government, and the leader, personified in the head of the state, the highest leader of the government, portrayed with almost superhuman qualities. The control characteristics of the totalitarian state, therefore, are limited to terror, propaganda, and the suppression of individuals and collective rights, which are also imposed on private life of citizens. Making extensive use of censorship and violence, mainly against minorities such as gypsies, immigrants, etc., the totalitarian regimes established themselves in several European countries after the First World War. Next, we'll see three different forms of totalitarianism in Europe: Italian fascism, German Nazism, and Soviet Stalinism. Late allies of the victorious nations of World War I, the Italians did not obtain important territorial compensations after the end of the conflict, such as the annexation of one of the former German colonies in Africa or from the nearest regions in the Balkans. So it wasn't worth it to have entered the war, taking into account the serious economic crisis, inflation, famine, and unemployment resulting from the conflict. This situation favored several social movements and workers in revolt against the government. In 1919, a former combatant, Benito Mussolini, founded the Fascigi Combattimento, an extreme nationalist group. They defended the establishment of a strong and authoritarian government capable of containing the left groups and to put an end to strikes and operational demonstrations. With around 320,000 supporters at the beginning of the 1920s, the Fascigi Combattimento counted on black shirts, armed militias dressed in black shirts, who acted cruelly against opponents. They murdered left-wing militants, dissolved workers' demonstrations, and intimidated democratically oriented politicians, all under the complacency of the government of King Victor Emmanuel III. In 1921, the Fascigi Combattimento unified under the authority of Mussolini and they constituted the National Fascist Party. Its support base was formed above all by unemployed people, ex-combatants, members of the middle class, industrialists, and owners fearful that Italy would become the scene of a communist revolution. In the 1921 parliamentary elections, 35 fascist deputies were elected, among them Mussolini. In 1922, in a show of strength, around 30,000 black shirts under Mussolini's leadership, invaded the Italian capital, occupying public buildings and railway stations. The episode became known as March on Rome. 2 days later, fascism would come to power. King Victor Emmanuel III invited Mussolini to take over as prime minister. Gradually, Mussolini expanded his powers and established himself as a dictator. The National Fascist Party became the only party. All others were extinct. The government also began to censor the media and suppress the right to strike. All organizations that did not have fascist leanings became illegal. In the early 1930s, the Duce, as Mussolini was known, already centralized all power. In order to indoctrinate children and young people into the fascist ideology, teachers at schools and universities had the obligation to extol the achievements of the regime and aspects of the Duce's life. Organizations were also created to promote parties, competitions, camps, outdoor activities, so that they would transmit the fascist ideology to the young. Mussolini also used the mass media, newspaper, radio programs, and documentaries to publicize the achievements of his government and spread a cult to his figure. 2 other aspects of fascist politics contributed to its consolidation among the Italian people. The first was the massive intervention of the state in the economy, especially after the New York Stock Exchange crash in 1929. To preserve itself from the crisis, the fascist state launched a broad program of construction of public works, roads, bridges, etc., and encouraged weapons production. These measures brought down unemployment levels. The second aspect of this policy was the institution in 1927 of the Carta del Lavoro, labor charter, in which concessions to workers were mixed with measures of police control. The charter established, for example, insurance against accidents at work and guaranteed an 8-hour workday, but it prohibited strikes and extinguished unions. In 1935, Mussolini ordered the invasion of Ethiopia, which was one of the 2 African countries not yet dominated by Europeans. The following year, he intervened in the Spanish Civil War, sending troops in support of the forces of Spanish General Francisco Franco. Fascist principles were not, however, restricted to Italy. With the consolidation of Mussolini's government, there were also dictatorships of the extreme right also in other European countries, such as Portugal, Hungary, and Poland. This was the context of the rise of Nazism in 1933 in Germany. At the end of World War I, Germany entered a socio-economic and political crisis of major proportions. Armed rebellions by socialist groups trying to seize power, the economy devastated by the fines imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, and one of the biggest inflations of all time. In addition, there was a sense of humiliation and dishonor arising from the harsh terms of the Treaty of Peace. Under these conditions, in 1919, the National Socialist German Workers was formed, which in German would give rise to the expression Nazi, led by Austrian Adolf Hitler. With an ultra-nationalist orientation, the Nazi Party proposed the establishment of a government capable of unifying the Germans and regaining national greatness. German Nazis were known as SA, acronym in German for assault troops. In addition to violently repressing communists and socialists, the SA guaranteed the safety of Nazi allies. In November 1923, Hitler, supported by the party, tried to carry out a coup d'etat, failed, and was arrested. In jail, he wrote the book Mein Kampf, in which he systematized the Nazi ideology. In the book, he defended the supposed purity and superiority of Aryan people over other ethnic groups. The book also claims the right from the Germans to a living space, that is, a territory in Europe that would bring together the Germanic people in one empire. Hitler did not initially gain significant support. However, in the 1930s, the New York Stock stock exchange crash and the Great Depression ruined the middle class and millions of German workers were unemployed. In this way, the crisis caused widespread disbelief in liberal principles. With his exaltation of the Aryan race, Hitler seemed to be the predestined leader, able to rescue the national honor and to place Germany again between the great powers. The Nazi Party began to grow. Thus, between 1930 and 1932, the number of Nazi deputies in parliament increased from 170 to 230. The following year, the president of Germany, Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, invited Hitler to fill the post of Chancellor. With the appointment of Hitler, the Nazis came to power in Germany, initiating what they considered the Third German Reich. After the death of Marshal Hindenburg in August 1934, Hitler unified the offices of Chancellor and President, thus adopting the title of Führer. Upon assuming power, Hitler annulled the 1919 Democratic Constitution, instituted censorship, suspended civil rights and guarantees, and instituted the anti-Semitism as official state policy. Members of the Gestapo, German secret police, and the SS, elite Nazi troops, began to pursue, arrest, and torture priests, gypsies, LGBT+, Jewish people, union leaders, communists, and opponents in general. For example, people with disabilities were forcibly admitted and had to go through sterilization surgeries. In addition to terror and repression, the Nazi ideological propaganda was also present on film, documentaries, radio shows, and posters. Hitler's rallies, which drew thousands of people, were painstakingly prepared to demonstrate the greatness of the Führer and the German people. Indoctrination also involved children in the classroom. From an early age, they learned to be proud of belonging to the Aryan race, in addition to venerate and render obedience to the Führer. The regime's popularity grew even more with the economic recovery of the country. Due to state intervention, public works were carried out, the armaments industry was boosted, and economic planning renovated. With the expansion of credit, fiscal policies, and specific policies investment, in addition to the population's access to durable consumer goods, taxes on many products have been reduced to encourage the industry. Investing in public works, such as road construction and building maintenance, in turn generated a large number of jobs. Large international and national capitalists also helped financially the Nazi government. With economic growth and the support of the population, Hitler began to violate the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles signed at the end of the First World War. He remilitarized Germany and implemented an expansionist territorial policy. He thus paved the way for World War II. In December 1925, just over a year after Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin officially assumed command of the Soviet Union. The new leader increasingly centralized power, abolished the democratic resources of the Soviets, suppressed individual rights, arrested and murdered opponents, and created a one-party totalitarian state, the Communist Party of Soviet Union. To modernize the country and make it grow economically, Stalin put in practice from 1928 the 5-year plans, which consisted of development programs based on nationalized economic planning. The government invested in the machinery and equipment industry at the expense of the consumer goods industry. Steel mills, chemical and oil industries, tractor and agricultural equipment factories were built. In the countryside, a forced collectivization policy was applied, with the nationalization of rural properties transformed into huge collective farms and large cooperatives. The government also promoted an educational reform that practically ended illiteracy in the country. The transport and housing became accessible to the population. However, individual and collective rights were practically extinct and strikes were prohibited. The secret police pursued opponents of the regime and even former allies. Between 1936 and 1938, more than 5 million Soviets were arrested. Many ended up executed. Peasants who reacted to the government were also arrested and murdered. About 11 million of these people were eventually deported. Many were sent to the gulags, forced labor camps created throughout the country to shelter opponents of the regime. Stalin was worshipped through military parades and in huge portraits. With it, the dream of an egalitarian and democratic society of the first socialists turned into the nightmare of an iron police state controlled by Communist Party leadership. Between 1923 and 1930, Spain was under a fascist-inspired military dictatorship led by Primo de Rivera, who assumed power with the endorsement of King Alfonso XIII. In 1931, elections were held for an assembly constituent. Anarchists, communists, and socialists conquered about 70% of the vote. The king renounced the throne, and in April 1931, the assembly proclaimed the republic. In this, a democratic Spain was emerging. The new rulers put into practice a series of changes, such as promoting the separation of church and state, implemented educational, labor, and agrarian reform. On one side, the Popular Front brought together democratic Republican sectors and groups of the left, supported by the workers and a part of the middle class. On another side, the Phalange, with a fascist tendency, grouped together large military landowners and representatives of the church and the urban bourgeoisie. The right won the 1933 elections and sought to nullify all laws approved in 1931. 3 years later, in 1936, the left won the majority of votes and returned to power. The new government granted amnesty to political prisoners, increased workers' wages, and resumed agrarian reform processes. The political polarization in Spain reached its culmination. The assassination of a monarchist leader by left-wing gunmen served as a trigger for an armed uprising against the government. In July 1936, Spanish troops led by General Francisco Franco, linked to the Phalange, rebelled in Morocco, which was a Spanish colony in Africa. Thus began the Spanish Civil War, which divided the Spanish territory. The military believed they would have a quick victory, but they were surprised by the strong resistance of the population, who armed themselves and set up barricades in the streets of several Spanish cities. Realizing that the Republican resistance would be long, the military resorted to external assistance. As a result, the war in Spain gained international dimensions. The governments of Italy and Germany sent soldiers, weapons, ammunition, tanks, and armed vehicles in support of the troops. The government of Portugal, which was under the dictatorship of Antonio Salazar, sent 13,000 soldiers to fight the Republicans, while U.S. companies provided weapons, trucks, and mainly oil to General Franco's forces. The government of the Soviet Union, in turn, collaborated with the Republicans, providing them with weapons, ammunition, planes, war vehicles, and sending them specialists in armaments and combat. In addition, approximately 50,000 volunteers from 53 countries formed the international brigades and fought against the Phalangists. Despite having the sympathy of intellectuals, the Spanish Republican government did not get the support of the European democracies and the government of the United States, which preferred to adopt a policy of no intervention. To make matters worse, from 1938, the Soviet government increasingly reduced its presence in the conflict, which significantly weakened the strength of the Republicans. The war ended in 1939, leaving a toll of 1 million dead. Phalangists won, and Franco took power as a dictator, which he held until his death